welcome back to Storytime. So, this is our second episode reading Agatha Christie's Man in the Brown Coat, brown suit, yeah, in the brown suit. I'm going to have to change that in the description. I think I said coat in there. Anyways, yes, Man in the Brown Suit by Agatha Christie. We are probably about a quarter of the way through. Something really interesting occurred to Anne Bedingfield at the end of the last chapter that we read last time. I am intrigued to see what will happen. There is much, supposition as to what it could be. It was quite a wonderful revelation when I found out that there are actually Agatha Christie novels that are becoming public domain. So far, there are only 4. I think 2 or 3 of them are Poirot's, and this one is sort of a standalone. Interested to see where it goes to, because I've never heard of any of these characters. Anyways, let's get back to it. Chapter 10. I was violently excited. I was sure that I had hit on the right trail at last. One thing was clear. I must not move out of the cabin. The asafoetida had got to be born. I examined my facts again. Tomorrow was the 22nd, and at 1 a.m. or 1 p.m. something would happen. I plumped for 1 a.m. It was now 7 o'clock. In 6 hours, I should know. I don't know how I got through the evening. I retired to my cabin fairly early. I had told the stewardess that I had a cold in the head and didn't mind smells. She still seemed distressed, but I was firm. The evening seemed interminable. I duly retired to bed, but in view of the emergencies, I swathed myself in a thick flannel dressing gown and encased my feet in slippers. Thus attired, I felt that I could spring up and take an active part in anything that happened. What did I expect to happen? I hardly knew. Vague fancies, most of them wildly inappropriate, flitted through my brain. But one thing I was fairly convinced of. At 1 o'clock, something would happen. At various times I heard fellow passengers coming to bed, fragments of conversation, laughing good nights, floating in through the open transom. Then, silence. Most of the lights went out. There was still one in the passage outside, and there was therefore a certain amount of light in my cabin. I heard 8 bells go. The hour that followed seemed the longest I had ever known. I consulted my watch surreptitiously, to be sure I had not overshot the time. If my deductions were wrong, if nothing happened at 1 o'clock, I should have made a fool of myself and spent all the money I had in the world on a mare's nest. My heart beat painfully. 2 bells went overheard. 1 o'clock. And nothing. Wait, what was that? I heard the quick, light patter of feet running along the passage. Then, with the suddenness of a bombshell, my cabin door burst open and a man almost fell inside. "Save me," he said hoarsely. "They're after me." There was not a moment for argument or explanation. I could hear footsteps outside. I had about 40 seconds in which to act. I had sprung to my feet and was standing facing the stranger in the middle of the cabin. A cabin does not abound in hiding places for a 6-foot man. With one arm I pulled out my cabin trunk. He slipped down under the bunk. I raised the lid. At the same time, with the other hand, I pulled down the wash basin. A deft movement, and my hair was screwed into a tiny knot on the top of my head. From the point of view of appearance, it was inartistic. From another standpoint, it was supremely artistic. A lady, with her hair screwed up into an unbecoming knob, and it was the act of removing a piece of soap from her trunk with which, apparently, to wash her neck. Could hardly be suspected of harboring a fugitive. There was a knock at the door, and without waiting for me to say, "Come in," it was pushed open. I don't know what I expected to see. I think I had vague ideas of Mr. Paget brandishing a revolver, or my missionary friend with a sandbag or some other lethal weapon. But I certainly did not expect to see a night stewardess with an inquiring face and looking the essence of respectability. "I beg your pardon, miss, I thought you called out." "No," I said, "I didn't." "I'm sorry for interrupting you." "It's all right," I said. "I couldn't sleep. I thought a wash would do me good." It sounded rather as though it were a thing I never had as a general rule. "I'm so sorry, miss," said the stewardess again, "but there's a gentleman about who's rather drunk, and we were afraid he might get into one of the ladies' cabins and frighten them." "How dreadful!" I said, looking alarmed. "He won't come in here, will he?" "Oh, I think so, miss. I don't think so, miss. Ring the bell if he does. Good night." "Good night." I opened the door and peeped down the corridor. Except for the retreating form of the stewardess, there was nobody in sight. Drunk. So that was the explanation of it. My histrionic talents had been wasted. I pulled the cabin trunk out a little further and said, "Come out at once, please," in an acid tone. There was no answer. I peered under the bunk. My visitor lay immovable. He seemed to be asleep. I tugged at his shoulder. He did not move. Dead drunk, I thought vexedly. What am I to do? Then I saw something that made me catch my breath, a small scarlet spot on the floor. Using all my strength, I succeeded in dragging the man out into the middle of the cabin. The dead whiteness of his face showed that he had fainted. I found the cause of his fainting easily enough. He had been stabbed under the left shoulder blade, a nasty, deep wound. I got his coat off and set to work to attend to it. At the sting of the cold water, he stirred, then sat up. "Keep still, please," I said. He was the kind of young man who recovers his faculties very quickly. He pulled himself to his feet and stood there, swaying a little. "Thank you. I don't need anything done for me." His manner was defiant, almost aggressive. Not a word of thanks, or even common gratitude. "That is a nasty wound. You must let me dress it." "You will do nothing of the kind." He flung the words in my face, as though I had been begging a favor of him. My temper, never placid, rose. "I cannot congratulate you on your manners," I said coldly. "I can at least relieve you of my presence." He started for the door, but reeled as he did so. With an abrupt movement, I pushed him down upon the sofa. "Don't be a fool," I said unceremoniously. "You don't want to go bleeding all over the ship, do you?" He seemed to see the sense of that, for he sat quietly whilst I bandaged up the wound as best I could. "There," I said, bestowing a pat on my handiwork. "That will have to do for the present. Are you better tempered now, and do you feel inclined to tell me what that's all about?" "I'm sorry that I can't satisfy your very natural curiosity." "Why not?" I said, chagrined. He smiled nastily. "If you want a thing broadcast, tell a woman. Otherwise, keep your mouth shut." "Don't you think I could keep a secret?" "I don't think. I know." He rose to his feet. "At any rate," I said spitefully, "I shall be able to do a little broadcasting about the events of this evening." "I've no doubt you will, too," he said indifferently. "How dare you!" I cried angrily. We were facing at each other, glaring at each other with the ferocity of bitter enemies. For the first time I took in the details of his appearance, the close-cropped dark head, the lean jaw, the scar on the brown cheek, the curious light gray eyes that looked into mine with a sort of reckless mockery, hard to describe. There was something dangerous about him. "You haven't thanked me yet for saving your life," I said with false sweetness. I hid him there. I saw him flinch distinctly. Intuitively, I knew that he hated above all to be reminded that he owed his life to me. I didn't care. I wanted to hurt him. I had never wanted to hurt anyone so much. "I wish to God you hadn't," he said explosively. "I'd be better dead and out of it." "I'm glad you acknowledge the debt. You can't get out of it. I saved your life, and I'm waiting for you to say thank you." If looks could have killed, I think he would have liked to kill me then. He pushed roughly past me. At the door he turned back and spoke over his shoulder. "I shall not thank you, now or at any other time, but I acknowledge the debt. Some day I will pay it." He was gone, leaving me with clenched hands and my heart beating like a mill race. Chapter 11. There were no further excitements that night. I had breakfast in bed and got up late the next morning. Mrs. Blair hailed me as I came on deck. "Good morning, gypsy girl. Sit down here by me. You look as though you hadn't slept well." "Why do you call me that?" I asked as I sat down obediently. "Do you mind? It suits you somehow." "I've called you that in my own mind from the beginning. It's the gypsy element in you that makes you so different from everyone else. I decided in my own mind that you and Colonel Race were the only two people on board who wouldn't bore me to death to talk to." "That's funny," I said. "I thought the same about you, only it's more understandable in your case. You're such an exquisitely finished product." "Not badly put," said Mrs. Blair, nodding her head. "Tell me about yourself, gypsy girl. Why are you going to South Africa?" I told her something about Papa's life work. "So you're Charles Bedingfeld's daughter. I thought you weren't a mere provincial miss. Are you going to Broken Hill to grub up more skulls?" "I may," I said cautiously. "I've got other plans as well." "What a mysterious minx you are. But you do look tired this morning. Didn't you sleep well? I can't keep awake on board a boat. 10 hours sleep for a fool, they say. I could do with 20. She yawned, looking like a sleepy kitten. "An idiot of a steward woke me up in the middle of the night to return me that roll of film I dropped yesterday. He did it in the most melodramatic manner, stuck his arm through the ventilator and dropped them neatly in the middle of my tummy. I thought it was a bomb for a moment." "Here's your colonel," I said, as the tall, soldierly figure of Colonel Race appeared on the deck. "He's not my colonel particularly. In fact, he admires you very much, gypsy girl. So don't run away." "I want to tie something round my head. It will be more comfortable than a hat." I slipped quickly away. For some reason or other, I was uncomfortable with Colonel Race. He was one of the few people who was capable of making me feel shy. I went down to my cabin and began looking for something with which I could restrain my rebellious locks. Now I am a tidy person. I like my things always arranged in a certain way, and I keep them so. I had no sooner opened my drawer than I realized that somebody had been disarranging my things. Everything had been turned over and scattered. I looked in the other drawer and the small hanging cupboard. They told the same tale. It was as though someone had been making a hurried and ineffectual search for something. I sat down on the edge of the bunk with a grave face. Who had been searching my cabin, and what had they been looking for? Was it the half-sheet of paper with scribbled figures and words? I shook my head, dissatisfied. Surely that was past history now. But what else could there be? I wanted to think. The events of last night, though exciting, had not really done anything to elucidate matters. Who was the young man who had burst into my cabin so abruptly? I had not seen him on board previously, either on deck or in the saloon. Was he one of the ship's company, or was he a passenger? Who had stabbed him? Why had they stabbed him? And why, in the name of goodness, should cabin number 17 figure so prominently? It was all a mystery, but there was no doubt that some very peculiar occurrences were taking place in the Kilmorden Castle. I counted off on my fingers the people on whom it behoved me to keep watch. Setting aside my visitor of the night before, but promising myself that I would discover him on board before another day had passed, I selected the following persons as worthy of my notice. 1. Sir Eustace Pedlar. He was the owner of the mill house, and his presence on the Kilmorden Castle seemed something of a coincidence. 2. Mr. Paget, the sinister-looking secretary, whose eagerness to obtain cabin 17 had been so very marked. And B. Find out whether he had accompanied Sir Eustace to Cannes. 3. The Reverend Edward Chichester. All I had against him was his obstinacy over cabin 17, and that might be entirely due to his own peculiar temperament. Obstinacy can be an amazing thing. But a little conversation with Mr. Chichester would not come amiss, I decided. Hastily tying a handkerchief round my hair, I went up on deck again, full of purpose. I was in luck. My quarry was leaning against the rail, drinking beef tea. I went up to him. "I hope you've forgiven me over cabin 17, I said with my best smile. "I consider it unchristian to bear a grudge," said Mr. Chichester coldly, but the purser had distinctly promised me that cabin. "Pursers are such busy men, aren't they?" I said vaguely. "I suppose they're bound to forget sometimes." Mr. Chichester did not reply. "Is this your first visit to South Africa?" I inquired conversationally. "To South Africa, yes, but I have worked for the last 2 years amongst the cannibal tribes in the interior of East Africa." "How thrilling! Have you had many narrow escapes?" "Escapes? Of being eaten, I mean." "You should not treat sacred subjects with levity, Miss Bedingfeld." "I didn't know that cannibalism was a sacred subject," I retorted, stung. As the words left my lips, another idea struck me. If Mr. Chichester had indeed spent the last 2 years in the interior of Africa, how was it that he was not more sunburnt? His skin was as pink and white as a baby's. Surely there was something fishy there. Yet his manner and voice were so absolutely it. Too much so, perhaps. Was he, or was he not, just a little like a stage clergyman? I cast my mind back to the curates I had known at Little Hampsley. Some of them I had liked, some of them I had not, but certainly none of them had been quite like Mr. Chichester. They had been human. He was a glorified type. I was debating all this when Sir Eustace Pedlar passed down the deck. Just as he was abreast of Mr. Chichester, he stopped and picked up a piece of paper, which he handed to him, remarking, "You've dropped something." He passed on without stopping, and so probably did not notice Mr. Chichester's agitation. I did. Whatever it was he had dropped, its recovery agitated him considerably. He turned a sickly green, and crumpled up the sheet of paper into a ball. My suspicions were accentuated 100-fold. He caught my eye and hurried into explanations. A fragment of a sermon I was composing," he said with a sickly smile. "Indeed," I rejoined politely. "A fragment of a sermon, indeed. No, Mr. Chichester, too weak for words." He soon left me with a muttered excuse. I wished, oh, how I wished that I had been the one to pick up that paper and not Sir Eustace Pedlar. One thing was clear. Mr. Chichester could not be exempted from my list of suspects. I was inclined to put him top of the 3. After lunch, when I came up to the lounge for coffee, I noticed Sir Eustace and Paget sitting with Mrs. Blair and Colonel Race. Mrs. Blair welcomed me with a smile, so I went over and joined them. They were talking about Italy. "But it is misleading," Mrs. Blair insisted. "Aqua calda certainly ought to be cold water, not hot." "You're not a Latin scholar," said Sir Eustace, smiling. Men are so superior about their Latin, said Mrs. Blair, but all the time I notice that when you ask them to translate inscriptions in old churches, they can never do it. They hem and haw and get out of it somehow. Quite right, said Colonel Race. I always do. But I love the Italians, continued Mrs. Blair. They're so obliging, though even that has its embarrassing side. You ask them in the way somewhere, and instead of saying first to the right, second to the left, or something that one could follow, they pour out a flood of well-meaning directions, and when you look bewildered, they take you kindly by the arm and walk all the way there with you. Is that your experience in Florence, Paget? Asked Sir Eustace, turning with a smile to his secretary. For some reason, the question seemed to disconcert Mr. Paget. He stammered and flushed. Oh, quite so, yes, quite so. Then, with a murmured excuse, he rose and left the table. I'm beginning to suspect Guy Paget of having committed some dark deed in Florence, remarked Sir Eustace, gazing after his secretary's retreating figure. Whenever Florence or Italy is mentioned, he changes the subject or bolts precipitately. Oh, that is a word. Perhaps he murdered somebody there, said Mrs. Blair hopefully. He looks... I hope I'm not hurting your feelings, Sir Eustace, but he does look as though he might murder someone. Yes, per cinquecento. Cinquecento. It amuses me sometimes, especially when one knows as well as I do how essentially law-abiding and respectable the poor fellow really is. He's been with you some time, hasn't he, Sir Eustace? Asked Colonel Race. 6 years, said Sir Eustace with a deep sigh. He must be quite invaluable to you, said Mrs. Blair. Oh, invaluable, yes, quite invaluable. The poor man sounded even more depressed, as though the invaluableness of Mr. Paget was a secret grief to him. Then he added more briskly, But this face should really inquire of you with confidence, my dear lady. No self-respecting murderer would ever consent to look like one. Crippen, now, I believe, was one of the pleasantest fellows imaginable. He was caught on a liner, wasn't he? Murmured Mrs. Blair. There was a slight rattle behind us. I turned quickly. Mr. Chichester had dropped his coffee cup. Our party soon broke up. Mrs. Blair went below to sleep, and I went out on deck. Colonel Race followed me. You're very elusive, Miss Bettingfeld. I looked for you everywhere last night at the dance floor. I went to bed early, I exclaimed. Are you going to run away tonight, too, or are you going to dance with me? I shall be very pleased to dance with you, I murmured shyly. But Mrs. Blair, our friend Mrs. Blair, doesn't care for dancing. And do you? I care for dancing with you. Oh, I said nervously. I was a little afraid of Colonel Race. Nevertheless, I was enjoying myself. This was better than discussing fossilized skulls with stodgy old professors. Colonel Race was really just my ideal of a stern, silent Rhodesian. Possibly I might marry him. I hadn't been asked, it is true, but as the Boy Scouts say, be prepared. And all women, without in the least meaning it, consider every man they meet as a possible husband for themselves or their best friend. I danced several times with him that evening. He danced well. When the dancing was over and I was thinking of going to bed, he suggested a turn round the deck. We walked round 3 times and finally subsided into 2 deck chairs. There was nobody else in sight. We made desultory conversation for some time. Do you know, Miss Bettingfeld, I think I once met your father. A very interesting man. On his own subject, and it's a subject that has a special fascination for me. In my humble way, I've done a bit in that line myself. Why, when I was in the Dordogne region, our talk became technical. Colonel Race's boast was not an idle one. He knew a great deal. At the same time, he made one or two curious mistakes. Slips of the tongue, I might almost have thought them. But he was quick to take his cue from me and to cover them up. Once he spoke of the Mousterian period as succeeding the Aurignacian, an absurd mistake for one who knew anything of the subject. It was 12 o'clock when I went to my cabin. I was still puzzling over those queer discrepancies. Was it possible that he had got the whole subject up for the occasion, that really he knew nothing of archaeology? I shook my head, vaguely dissatisfied with that solution. Just as I was dropping off to sleep, I sat up with a sudden start as another idea flashed into my head. Had he been pumping me? Were those slight inaccuracies just tests to see whether I really knew what I was talking about? In other words, he suspected me of not being genuinely Anne Bedingfeld? Why? Chapter 12. Excerpt from the Diary of Sir Eustace Pedlar. There is something to be said for life on board ship. It is peaceful. My grey hairs fortunately exempt me from the indignities of bobbing for apples, running up and down deck with potatoes and eggs, and the more painful sports of Brother Bill and Bolster Bar. What amusement people can find in those painful proceedings has always been a mystery to me. But there are many fools in the world. One praises God for their existence and keeps out of their way. Fortunately, I am an excellent sailor. Paget, poor fellow, is not. He began turning green as soon as we were out of the Solent. I presumed my other so-called secretary is also seasick. At any rate, he has not made an appearance. But perhaps it is not seasickness, but high diplomacy. The great thing is that I have not been worried by him. On the whole, the people on board are a mangy lot, only 2 decent bridge players and 1 decent-looking woman, Mrs. Clarence Blair. I've met her in town, of course. She is one of the only women I know who can lay claim to a sense of humor. I enjoy talking to her, and should enjoy it more if it were not for long-legged taciturn ass who attached himself to her like a limpet. I cannot think that this Colonel Race really amuses her. He's good-looking in his way, but dull as ditch water. One of those strong, silent men that lady novelists and young girls always rave over. Guy Paget struggled up on deck after we left Madeira and began babbling in a hollow voice about work. What the devil does anyone want to work for on board ship? It is true that I promised my publishers my reminiscences early in the summer, but what of it? Who really reads reminiscences? Old ladies in the suburbs. And what do my reminiscences amount to? I knocked against a certain number of so-called famous people in my lifetime. With the assistance of Paget, I invented insipid anecdotes about them. And truth of the matter is, Paget is too honest for the job. He won't let me invent anecdotes about the people I have not yet met, that I have met, but haven't. I tried kindness with him. You look a perfect wreck still, my dear chap, I said easily. What you need is a deck chair in the sun. Nope. Not another word. The work must wait. The next thing I knew, he was worrying about an extra cabin. There's no room to work in your cabin, Sir Eustace. It's full of trunks. From his tone, you might have thought the trunks were black beetles, something that had no business to be there. I explained to him that, though he might not be aware of the fact, it was unusual to take a change of clothes with one when traveling. He gave the wan smile with which he always greets my attempts at humor, and then reverted to the business in hand. And we can hardly work in my little hole. I know Paget's little holes. He usually has the best cabin on the ship. I'm sorry the captain didn't turn out for you this time, I said, sarcastically. Perhaps you'd like to dump some of your extra luggage in my cabin. Sarcasm is dangerous with a man like Paget. He brightens up at once. Well, if I could get rid of the typewriter in the stationery trunk. The stationery trunk weighs several solid tons. It causes endless unpleasantness with the porters, and it is the aim of Paget's life to foist it on me. It is a perpetual struggle between us. He seems to regard it as my special personal property. I, on the other hand, regard the charge of it as the only thing where a secretary is really useful. We'll get an extra cabin, I said hastily. The thing seemed simple enough, but Paget is a person who loves to make mysteries. He came to me the next day with a face like a Renaissance conspirator. You know, you told me to get cabin 17 for an office. Well, what of it? Is the secretary's trunk jammed in the doorway? The doorways are the same size in all the cabins, replied Paget seriously. But I tell you, Sir Eustace, there's something very queer about that cabin. Memories of raiding the upper berth floated through my mind. If you mean that it's haunted, I said, we're not going to sleep there, so I don't see that it matters. Ghosts don't affect typewriters. Paget said that it wasn't a ghost and that, after all, he hadn't got cabin 17. He told me a long, garbled story. Apparently he and a Mr. Chichester and a girl named Bedingfeld had almost come to blows over the cabin. Needless to say, the girl had won, and Paget was apparently feeling sore over the matter. Both 13 and 28 are better cabins, he reiterated, but they wouldn't look at them. Well, I said, stifling a yawn, that matter no more would you, my dear Paget. He gave me a reproachful look. You told me to get cabin 17. There was a touch of the boy upon the burning deck about Paget. My dear fellow, I said testily, I mentioned number 17 because I happened to observe that it was vacant, but I didn't mean you to make a stand to the death about it. 13 or 28 would have done us equally well. He looked hurt. There's something more, though, he insisted. Miss Bedingfeld got the cabin, but this morning I saw Chichester coming out of it in a furtive sort of way. I looked at him severely. You're trying to get up a nasty scandal about Chichester, who was a missionary, though a perfectly poisonous person, and that attractive child Anne Bedingfeld. I don't believe a word of it. I said coldly, Anne Bedingfeld is an extremely nice girl with particularly good legs. I should say she had far and away the best legs on board. Paget did not like my references to Anne Bedingfeld's legs. He is the sort of man who never notices legs himself, or if he does, would die sooner than say so. Also, I think my appreciation of such things frivolous. He thinks my appreciation of such things frivolous. I like annoying Paget, so I continued maliciously. Hang on just a second. I need to report. Yeah, we'll report. There we go. I guess I'll not do that. Anyway, sorry about that pause there. I was trying to do something, but it's taking longer than I was hoping. Where am I? Okay, sorry about that. As you've made her acquaintance, you might ask her to dine at our table tomorrow night. It's the fancy dress dance. But by the way, you'd better go down to the barber and select a fancy costume for me. Surely you will not go in fancy dress, said Paget in tones of horror. I could see that it was quite incompatible with his idea of my dignity. He looked shocked and pained. I had really had no intention of donning fancy dress, but the complete discomfiture of Paget was too tempting to be forborne. "What do you mean?" I said. "Of course I shall wear fancy dress. So will you." Paget shuddered. "So go down to the barber's and see about it," I finished. "I don't think he'll have any out sizes," murmured Paget, finishing my figure with his eyes. Measuring my figure with his eye. Without meaning it, Paget can occasionally be extremely offensive. "And order a table for 6 in the saloon," I said. "We'll have the captain, the girl with the nice legs, Mrs. Blair—" "You won't get Mrs. Blair without Colonel Race," Paget interposed. "He asked her to dine with him, I know." Paget always knows everything. I was justifiably annoyed. "Who is Race?" I demanded, exasperated. As I said before, Paget always knows everything, or thinks he does. He looked mysterious again. "They see he's a Secret Service chap, Sir Eustace. Rather a great gun, too, but of course I don't know for certain." "Isn't that like the government?" I exclaimed. "Here's a man on board whose business it is to carry about secret documents, and they go giving them to a peaceful officer who only asks to be let alone." Paget looked even more mysterious. He came a pace nearer and dropped his voice. "If you ask me, the whole thing is very queer, Sir Eustace. Look at the illness of mine before we started." "My dear fellow," I interrupted brutally, "that was a bilious attack. You're always having bilious attacks." Paget winced slightly. "It wasn't the usual sort of bilious attack this time. For God's sake, don't go into detail of your condition, Paget. I don't want to bear them." "Very well, Sir Eustace, but my belief is that I was deliberately poisoned." "Ah," I said, "you've been talking to Rayburn." He did not deny it. "At any rate, Sir Eustace, he thinks so, and he should be in the position to know." "By the way, where is the chap?" I asked. "I've not set eyes on him since we came on board." "He gives out that he's ill and says he's stays in his cabin, Sir Eustace." Paget's voice dropped over. "But that's camouflage, I'm sure, so that he can watch better." "Watch? Over your safety, Sir Eustace, in case an attack should be made upon you." "You're such a cheerful fellow, Paget," I said. "I trust that your imagination runs away with you. If I were you, I should be to the dance as a death's head or an executioner. It will suit your mournful style of beauty." That shut him up for the time being. I went on deck. The Bedingfeld girl was deep in conversation with the missionary Parson Chichester. Women always flutter around parsons. A man of my figure hates stooping, but I had the courtesy to pick up a bit of paper that was fluttering round the parson's feet. I got no word of thanks for my pains. As a matter of fact, I couldn't help seeing what was written on the sheet of paper. There was just one sentence. Don't try to play a lone hand, or it will be the worse for you." That's a nice thing for a person to have. Who is this fellow Chichester, I wonder? He looks mild as milk, but looks are deceptive. I shall ask Paget about him. Paget always knows everything. I sank gracefully into my deck chair by the side of Mrs. Blair, thereby interrupting her tete-a-tete with Race, and remarked that I didn't know what the clergy were coming to nowadays. Then I asked her to dine with me on the night of the fancy dress dance. Somehow or other, Race managed to get included in the invitation. After lunch, the Bedingfeld girl came and sat with us for coffee. I was right about her legs. They are the best on the ship. I shall certainly ask her to dinner as well. I would very much like to know what mischief Paget was up to in Florence. Whenever Italy is mentioned, he goes to pieces. If I did not know how intensely respectable he is, I should suspect him of some disreputable amour. I wonder now, even the most respectable man, it would cheer me up enormously if it were so. Paget was with a guilty secret. Splendid. Going to take just a really quick break to report this bot person. Next, yes. Alright, that's... Yes. I would like to block. And close. Excellent. Okay. Got that taken care of. And now I will close that so I can see chat. There we go. Sorry about that delay there. A bot appeared in chat. Alright. Continuing. Chapter lucky number 13. It has been a curious evening. The only costume that fitted me in the barber's emporium was that of a teddy bear. I don't mind playing bears with some nice young girls on a winter's evening in England, but it's hardly an ideal costume for the equator. However, I created a good deal of merriment and won first prize for brought on board, an absurd term for a costume hired for the evening. Still, as nobody seemed to have the least idea whether they were made or bought, it didn't matter. Mrs. Blair refused to dress up. Apparently she's at one with Paget on the matter. Colonel Race followed her example, and Bedingfeld had concocted a gypsy costume for herself, and looked extraordinarily well. Paget said he had a headache and didn't appear. To replace him, I asked a quaint little fellow called Reeves. He's a prominent member of the South African Labour Party. Horrible little man, but I want to keep in with him, as he gives me information that I need. I want to understand this Rand business from both sides. Dancing was a hot affair. I danced twice with Anne Bedingfeld, and she had to pretend she liked it. I danced once with Mrs. Blair, who didn't trouble to pretend, and I victimized various other damsels whose appearance struck me favorably. Then he went down to supper. I had ordered champagne. The steward suggested Cliquot 1911 as being the best they had on the boat, and I fell in with his suggestion. I seem to have hit on the other thing that would loosen Colonel Race's tongue. Far from being taciturn, the man becomes actually talkative. For a while this amused me. Then it occurred to me that Colonel Race, and not myself, was becoming the life and soul of the party. He chaffed me at length about keeping a diary. It will reveal all your indiscretions one of these days, peddler. My dear Race, I said, I venture to suggest that I am not quite the fool you think me. I may commit indiscretions, but I don't write them down in black and white. After my death, my executors will know my opinion of a great many people, but I doubt if they will find anything to add or detract from their opinions of me. A diary is useful for recording the idiosyncrasies of other people, but not one's own. There is such a thing as unconscious self-revelation, though. In the eyes of the psychoanalyst, all things are vile, I replied sententiously. You must have had a very interesting life, Colonel Race, said Miss Bedingfeld, gazing at me with wide, starry eyes. That's how they do it, these girls. Othello charmed Desdemona by telling her stories, but oh, didn't Desdemona charm Othello by the way she listened. Anyway, the girl set Race off all right. He began to tell lion stories. A man who has shot lions in large quantities has an unfair advantage over other men. It seemed to me that it was time I, too, told a lion story, one of a more sprightly character. By the way, I remarked, that reminds me of a rather exciting tale I heard. A friend of mine was out in the shooting trip somewhere in East Africa. One night he came out of his tent for some reason and was startled by a low growl. He turned sharply and saw a lion crouching to spring. He had left his rifle in the tent. Quick as thought he ducked, and the lion sprang right over his head. Annoyed at having missed him, the animal growled and prepared to spring again. Again he ducked, and again the lion sprang right over him. This happened a third time, but by now he was close to the entrance of his tent, and he darted in and seized his rifle. When he emerged, rifle in hand, the lion had disappeared. That puzzled him greatly. He crept round the back of the tent, where there was a little clearing. There, sure enough, was the lion, busy practicing low jumps. This was received by a roar of applause. I drank some champagne. On another occasion, I remarked, this friend of mine had a second curious experience. He was trekking across country, and being anxious to arrive at his destination before the heat of the day, he ordered his boys to inspan whilst it was still dark. They had some trouble in doing so, as the mules were very restive, but at last they managed it, and a start was made. The mules raced along like the wind, and when daylight came, they saw why. In the darkness, the boys had inspanned a lion as the near wheeler. This, too, was well received, a ripple of merriment going round the table, but I am not sure that the greatest tribute did not come from my friend the Labour member, who remained pale and serious. "My God," he said anxiously, "who's unharassed them?" "I must go to Rhodesia," said Mrs. Blair. "After what you have told us, Colonel Race, I simply must. It's a horrible journey, though. 5 days in the train." "You must join me in my private car," I said gallantly. "Oh, Sir Eustace, how sweet of you! Do you really mean it?" "Do I mean it?" I exclaimed reproachfully, and drank another glass of champagne. Just about another week, and we shall be in South Africa," sighed Miss Blair. "Ah, South Africa," I said sentimentally, and began to quote from a recent speech of mine at the Colonial Institute. "What has South Africa to show the world? What indeed? Her fruit and her farms, her wool and her wattles, her herds and her hides, her gold mines and her diamonds." I was hurrying on, because I knew that as soon as I paused, Reeves would butt in and inform me that the hides were worthless, because the animals hung themselves up on barbed wire or something of that sort, would crab everything else, and end up with the hardships of the miners on the Rand, and I was not in the mood for that was not in the mood to be abused as the capitalist. However, the interruption came from another source, of the magic word diamonds. "Diamonds," said Mrs. Blair ecstatically. "Diamonds," breathed Miss Bedingfeld. They both addressed Colonel Race. "I don't suppose you've been to Kimberley?" I had been to Kimberley, too, but I didn't manage to say so in time. Race was being inundated with questions. What were mines like? Was it true that the natives were kept shut up in compounds, and so on? Race answered their questions and showed a good knowledge of the subject. He described the methods of housing the natives, the searches instituted, and the various precautions that De Beers took. "Then it's particularly impossible to steal any diamonds?" asked Mrs. Blair with as keen an air of disappointment as though she had been journeying there for the express purpose. "Nothing's impossible, Mrs. Blair. Thefts do occur, like the case I told you of where the Kaffir hid the stone in his wound." "Yes, but on the large scale." "Once in recent years, just before the war, in fact. You must remember the case, Pedlar. You were in South Africa at the time." I nodded. "Tell us," cried Miss Bedingfeld. "Oh, do tell us." Ray smiled. Very well. You shall have the story. I suppose most of you have heard of Sir Lawrence Erdsley, great South African mining magnate. His mines were gold mines, but he comes into the story through his son. You may remember that just before the war, rumors were afield of a new potential Kimberley hidden somewhere in the rocky floor of British Guyana jungles. Two young explorers, so it was reported, had returned from that part of South America, bringing with them a remarkable collection. Oh, were we talking about South America? I thought we were talking about South Africa. Sorry. Two young explorers, so it was reported, had returned from the part of South America, bringing with them a remarkable collection of rough diamonds, some of them of considerable size. Diamonds of small size had been found before in the neighborhood of the Essequibo and Mazaruni rivers, but these two young men, John Erdsley and his friend Lucas, claimed to have discovered beds of great carbon deposits at the common head of two streams. The diamonds were of every color, pink, blue, yellow, green, black, and the purest white. Erdsley and Lucas came to Kimberley, where they were to submit their gems to inspection. At the same time, a sensational robbery was found to have taken place at De Beers. When sending diamonds to England, they were made up into a packet. This remains in the big safe, of which the two keys are held by two different men, whilst a third man knows the combination. They are handed to the bank, and the bank send them to England. Each package is worth roughly about £100,000. On this occasion, the bank were struck by something a little unusual about the sealing of the packet. It was opened and found to contain knobs of sugar. Exactly how suspicion came to fasten on John Erdsley, I do not know. It was remembered that he had been very wild at Cambridge, and that his father had paid his debts more than once. Anyhow, it soon got about that this story of South America diamond fields was all a fantasy. John Erdsley was arrested. In his possession was found a portion of the De Beers diamonds. But the case never came to court. Sir Lawrence Erdsley paid over a sum equal to the missing diamonds, and De Beers did not prosecute. Exactly how the robbery was committed has never been known, but the knowledge that his son was a thief broke the old man's heart. He had a stroke shortly afterwards. As for John, his fate was in a way merciful. He enlisted, went to the war, fought there bravely, and was killed, thus wiping out the stain on his name. Sir Lawrence himself had a third stroke and died about a month ago. He died intestate, and his vast fortune passed to his next of kin, a man whom he hardly knew. The colonel paused. A babble of ejaculations and questions broke out. Something seemed to attract Miss Bedingfeld's attention, and she turned in her chair. At the little gasp she gave, I, too, turned. My new secretary, Rayburn, was standing in the doorway. Under his tan, his face had the pallor of one who had seen a ghost. Evidently, Race's story had moved him profoundly. Suddenly conscious of our scrutiny, he turned abruptly and disappeared. "Do you know who that is?" asked Anne Bedingfeld abruptly. "It's my other secretary," I exclaimed. "Mr. Rayburn. He's been seedy up to now." She toyed with the bread on her plate. "Has he been your secretary long?" "Not very long," I said cautiously. "But cautious is useless to a woman. The more you hold back, the more she presses forward, and Bedingfeld made no bones about it." "How long?" she asked abruptly. "Well, I engaged him just before I sailed. Old friend of mine recommended him." She said nothing more, but relapsed into a thoughtful silence. I turned to Race with a feeling that it was my turn to display an interest in this story. "Who's Sir Lawrence's next of kin, Race, do you know?" I should do so, I replied with a smile. I am. I wasn't expecting that, I will admit. Chapter 14. Anne's narrative resumed. It was on the night of the fancy dress that I decided that the time had come for me to confide in someone. So far I had played a lone hand and rather enjoyed it. Now suddenly everything was changed. I distrusted my own knowledge, and for the first time a feeling of loneliness and desolation crept over me. I sat on the edge of my bunk, still in my gypsy dress, and considered the situation. I thought first of Colonel Race. He had seemed to like me. He would be kind, I was sure, and he was no fool. Yet as I thought it over, I wavered. He was a man of commanding personality. He would take the whole matter out of my hands, and it was my mystery. There were other reasons, too, which I would hardly acknowledge to myself, but which made it inadvisable to confide in Colonel Race. Then I thought of Mrs. Blair. She, too, had been kind to me. I did not delude myself into the belief that that really meant anything. It was probably a mere whim of the moment. All the same, I had it in my power to interest her. She was a woman who had experienced most of the ordinary sensations in life. I proposed to supply her with an extraordinary one, and I liked her ease of manner, her lack of sentimentality, her freedom from any form of affection. My mind was made up. I decided to seek her out then and there. She would hardly be in bed yet. And I remembered that I did not know the number of her cabin. My friend, the night stewardess, would probably know. I rang the bell. After some delay, it was answered by a man. He gave me the information I wanted. Mrs. Blair's cabin was number 71. He apologized for the delay in answering the bell, but explained that he had all the cabins to attend to. "Where's the stewardess, then?" I asked. "They all go off duty at 10 o'clock. No, I mean the night stewardess. No stewardess on at night, miss." But a stewardess came the other night about 1 o'clock. "You must have been dreaming, miss. There's no stewardess on duty after 10. He withdrew, and I was left to digest this morsel of information. Who was the woman who had come to my cabin on the night of the 22nd? My face grew graver as I realized the cunning and audacity of my unknown antagonist. Then, pulling myself together, I left my own cabin and sought that of Mrs. Blair. I knocked at the door. "Who's that?" called her voice from within. "It's me, Anne Bedingfeld." "Oh, come in, gypsy girl." I entered. A good deal of scattered clothing lay about, and Mrs. Blair herself was draped in one of the loveliest kimonos I had ever seen. It was all orange and gold and black, and made my mouth water to look at it. "Mrs. Blair," I said abruptly, "I want to tell you the story of my life. That is, if it's not too late and you won't be bored." "Oh, not a bit. I always hate going to bed," said Mrs. Blair, her face crinkling into smiles in the delightful way she had. "And I should love to hear the story of your life. You're a most unusual creature, gypsy girl. Nobody else would think of busting in on me at 1 a.m. to tell me the story of their life, especially after snubbing my natural curiosity for weeks as you have done. I'm not accustomed to being snubbed. It's been quite a pleasing novelty. Sit down on the sofa and unburden your soul." I told her the whole story. It took some time, as I was conscientious over all the details. She gave a deep sigh when I had finished, but she did not say at all that I had expected her to say. Instead, she looked at me, laughed a little, and said, "Do you know, Anne, you're a very unusual girl. Haven't you ever had qualms?" "Qualms?" I asked, puzzled. "Yes, qualms. Starting off alone with practically no money. What will you do when you find yourself in a strange country with all your money gone?" "It's no good bothering about that until it comes. I've got plenty of money still. The £25 that Mrs. Fleming gave me is practically intact. And then I won the sweep yesterday. That's another £15. Why, I've got lots of money. £40. Lots of money. My God, murmured Mrs. Blair. I couldn't do it, Anne. I've plenty of pluck in my own way. I couldn't start off gaily with a few pounds in my pocket, no idea as to what I was doing and where I was going. But that's the fun of it, I cried, thoroughly roused. It gives one such a splendid feeling of adventure. She looked at me, nodding once or twice, and then smiled. Lucky Anne. There aren't many people in the world who feel as you do. Well, I said impatiently, what do you think of it all, Mrs. Blair? I think it's the most thrilling thing I ever heard. Now, to begin with, you will stop calling me Mrs. Blair. Suzanne will be ever so much better. Is that agreed? I should love it, Suzanne. Good girl. Now let's get down to business. You say that in Sir Eustace's secretary, not that long-faced Paget, the other one, you recognized the man who was stabbed and came into your cabin for shelter? I nodded. That gives us two links connecting Sir Eustace with the tangle. The woman was murdered in his house, and it's his secretary who gets stabbed at the mystic hour of 1 o'clock. I don't suspect Sir Eustace himself, but it can't be all coincidence. There's a connection somewhere, even if he himself is unaware of it. Then there's the queer business of the stewardess, she continued thoughtfully. What was she like? I hardly noticed her. I was so excited and strung up, and a stewardess seemed such an anticlimax. But yes, I did think her face was familiar. Of course it would be if I'd seen her about the ship. Her face seemed familiar to you, said Suzanne. Sure she wasn't a man? She was very tall, I admitted. Hardly Sir Eustace, I should think, not Mr. Paget. Wait! She caught up a scrap of paper and began drawing feverishly. She inspected the results with her head poised on one side. A very good likeness of Reverend Edward Chichester. Now, for the etceteras. She passed the paper over to me. Is that your stewardess? Why, yes, I cried. Suzanne, how clever of you! She disdained the compliment with a light gesture. I've always had suspicions about the Chichester creature. Do you remember how he dropped his coffee cup and turned a sickly green when we were discussing Crippen the other day? And he tried to get to cabin 17. Yes, it all fits in so far. But what does that all mean? What was really meant to happen at 1 o'clock on cabin 17? It can't be the stabbing of the secretary. There would be no point in timing that for the special hour on a special day in a special place. No, it must have been some kind of appointment, and he was on his way to keep it when they knifed him. But who was the appointment with? Certainly not with you. It must have been with Chichester, or it might have been with Paget. That seems unlikely, I objected. They can see each other any time. We both sat silent for a moment or two. Then Suzanne started off on another track. Could there have been anything hidden in the cabin? It seems more probable, I agreed. It would explain my things being ransacked the next morning, but there was nothing hidden there, I'm sure of it. The young man couldn't have slipped something into the drawer the night before? I shook my head. I should have seen him. Could it have been your precious little bit of paper they were looking for? It might have been, but it seems rather senseless. It was only a time and a date, and they were both past by then. Suzanne nodded. That's so, of course. No, it wasn't the paper. By the way, have you got it with you? I'd rather like to see it. I had brought the paper with me as Exhibit A, and I handed it over to her. She scrutinized it, frowning. There's a dot after the 17. Why isn't there a dot after the 1, too? There's a space, I pointed out. Yes, there's a space, but... Suddenly she rose and peered at the paper, holding it as close under the light as possible. There was a repressed excitement in her manner. Anne, that isn't a dot. It's a flaw in the paper. A flaw in the paper, you see? So you've got to ignore it and just go by the spaces. The spaces. I had risen and was standing by her. I read out the figures as I now saw them. 171:22. You see, said Suzanne, isn't that the same? But not quite. It's 1 o'clock still and the 22nd. But it's cabin 71, my cabin, Anne. We stood staring at each other, so pleased at our new discovery and so rapt with excitement that you might have thought we had solved the whole mystery. Then I fell to earth with a bump. But, Suzanne, nothing happened here at 1 o'clock on the 22nd. Her face fell also. No, it didn't. Another idea struck me. This isn't your own cabin, is it, Suzanne? I mean, not the one you originally booked. No, the purser changed me into it. I wonder if it was booked before sailing for someone who didn't turn up. I suppose we could find out. We don't need to find out, Gypsy girl, said Suzanne. I know. The purser was telling me about it. The cabin was booked in the name of Mrs. Gray, but it seems that Mrs. Gray was merely a pseudonym for the famous Madame Nadina. She's a celebrated Russian dancer, you know. She's never appeared in London, but Paris has been quite mad about her. She had a terrific success there all through the war. A thoroughly bad lot, I believe, but most attractive. The purser expressed his regrets that she wasn't on board in the most heartfelt fashion when he gave me her cabin, and then Colonel Race told me a lot about her. It seems that there were very queer stories afloat in Paris. She was suspected of espionage, but they couldn't prove anything. I rather fancy Colonel Race was over there simply on that account. He's told me some very interesting things. There was a regular organized gang, not German in origin at all. In fact, the head of it, a man always referred to as the Colonel, was thought to be an Englishman, but they never got any clue to his identity. But there is no doubt that he controlled a considerable organization of international crooks. Robberies, espionage, assaults, he undertook them all, and usually provided an innocent scapegoat to pay the penalty. Diabolically clever he must have been. The woman was supposed to be one of his agents, but they couldn't get hold of anything to go on. Yes, Anne, we are on the right track. Oh, hi, Chitchell? I think that's how it goes. I'm sorry if you said that a while ago. I was totally engrossed. Yes, where am I? What would you like me to call you? Where are we? I'm going to backtrack a little bit. The purser expressed his regrets that she wasn't on board in a most heartfelt fashion when he gave me her cabin, and then Colonel Race told me a lot about her. It seems there were very queer stories afloat in Paris. She was suspected of espionage, but they couldn't prove anything. I rather fancy Colonel Race was over there simply on that account. He's told me some very interesting things. There was a regular organized gang, not German in any origin at all. In fact, the head of it, a man always referred to as the Colonel, was thought to be an Englishman, but they never got any clue to his identity. But there is no doubt that he controlled a considerable organization of international crooks. Robbers, espionage, assaults, he undertook them all, and usually provided an innocent scapegoat to pay the penalty. Diabolically clever he must have been. This woman was supposed to be one of his agents, but they couldn't get hold of anything to go on. Yes, Anne, we are on the right track. Nadina is just the woman to be mixed up in this business. The appointment on the morning of the 22nd was with her in this cabin. But where is she? Why didn't she sail? A light flashed upon me. She meant to sail, I said slowly. Then why didn't she? Because she was dead. Suzanne Nadina was the woman murdered in Marlowe. My mind went back to the bare room in the empty house, and there swept over me again the indefinable sensation of menace and evil. With it came the memory of the falling pencil and the discovery of the roll of films. A roll of films. That struck a more recent note. Where had I heard of a roll of films, and why did I connect that thought with Mrs. Blair? Suddenly, I flew at her and almost shook her in my excitement. Your films, the ones that were passed to you through the ventilator, wasn't that on the 22nd? The ones I lost? How do you know they were the same? Why would anyone return them to you that way in the middle of the night? It's a mad idea. No, they were a message. The films had been taken out of the yellow tin case and something else put inside. Have you still got it? I may have used it. No, here it is. I remembered I tossed it into the rack at the side of the bunk. She held it out to me. It was an ordinary, round tin cylinder, such as films are packed in for the tropics. I took it with trembling hand, but even as I did so, my heart leapt. It was noticeably heavier than it should have been. With shaking fingers, I peeled off the strip of adhesive plaster that kept it airtight. I pulled off the lid, and a stream of dull, glassy pebbles rolled onto the bed. Pebbles, I said, keenly disappointed. Pebbles? Cried Suzanne. The ring in her voice excited me. Pebbles! No, and not pebbles. Diamonds. Chapter 15. Diamonds! I stared, fascinated at the glassy heap on the bunk. I picked up one which, but for the weight, might have been a fragment of broken bottle. Are you sure, Suzanne? Oh, yes, my dear. I've seen rough diamonds too often to have any doubt. They're beauties, too, Anne. And some of them are unique, I should say. There's a history behind these. A history we heard tonight, I cried. You mean Colonel Race's story? It can't be a coincidence. He told it for a purpose. To see its effect, you mean? I nodded. Its effect on Sir Eustace? Yes. But even as I said it, a doubt assailed me. Was it Sir Eustace who had been subjected to a test, or had the story been told for my benefit? I remembered the impression I had received on that former night of having been deliberately pumped. For some reason or other, Colonel Race was suspicious. But where did he come in? What possible connection could he have with the affair? Who is Colonel Race? I asked. It's rather a question, said Suzanne. He's pretty well known as a big game hunter, and, as you heard him say last night, he was a distant cousin of Sir Lawrence Erdsley. I've never actually met him until this trip. He journeys to and from Africa a good deal. There's a general idea that he does Secret Service work. I don't know whether it's true or not. He's certainly rather a mysterious creature. I suppose he came into a lot of money at Sir Lawrence Erdsley's heir? My dear Anne, he must be rolling. You know he'd be a splendid match for you. I can't have a good go at him with you aboard the ship, I said, laughing. Oh, these married women. We do have pull, murmured Suzanne complacently. And everyone knows that I am absolutely devoted to Clarence, my husband, you know. It's so safe and pleasant to make love to a devoted wife. It must be very nice for Clarence to be married to someone like you. Well, I'm wearing to live with. Still, he can always escape to the Foreign Office where he fixes his eyelashes in his eye and goes to sleep in a big armchair. Oh, his eyeglass in his eye. We might cable him to tell us all he knows about Race. I love sending cables, and they annoy Clarence so. He always says a letter would have done as well. I don't suppose he'd tell us anything, though. He's so frightfully discreet. It's what makes him so hard to live with for long on end. But let us go on with our matchmaking. I'm sure Colonel Race is very attracted to you, Anne. Give him a couple of glances from those wicked eyes of yours, and the deed is done. Everyone gets engaged on board ship. There's nothing else to it. I don't want to get married. Don't you? Said Suzanne. Why not? I love being married, even to Clarence. I disdained her flippancy. What I want to know, I said with determination, what has Colonel Race got to do with this? He's in it somewhere. You don't think it was mere chance, his telling that story? No, I don't, I said decidedly. He was watching us all narrowly. You remember, some of the diamonds were discovered, not all. Perhaps these are the missing ones. Or perhaps... Perhaps what? I did not answer directly. I should like to know, I said, what became of the other man. Not Ardsley, but... what was his name? Lucas. We're getting some light on the thing, and, anyway... It's the diamonds all these people are after. It must have been to obtain possession of the diamonds that the man in the brown suit killed Nadina. He didn't kill her, I said sharply. Oh, of course he killed her. Who else could have done so? I don't know, but I'm sure he didn't kill her. He went into the house 3 minutes after her and came out as white as a sheet because he found her dead. But nobody else went in. Then the murderer was in the house already, or else he got in some other way. There's no need for him to pass the lodge. He could have climbed over the wall. Suzanne glanced at me sharply. The man in the brown suit, she mused. Who was he, I wonder? Anyway, he was identical with the doctor in the tube. He would have had time to remove his makeup and follow the woman to Marlowe. She and Carton were to have met there. They both had an order to view the same house, and if they took such elaborate precautions to make their meeting appear accidental, they must have suspected they were being followed. All the same, Carton did not know that his shadower was the man in the brown suit. When he recognized him, the shock was so great that he lost his head completely and stepped back onto the line. That all seems pretty clear, don't you think so, Anne? I did not reply. Yes, that's how it was. He took the paper from the dead man, and in his hurry and got away, he dropped it. Then he followed the woman to Marlowe. What did he do when he left there? When he had killed her, or, according to you, found her dead? Where did he go? Still I said nothing. I wonder now, said Suzanne musingly, is it possible that he induced Sir Eustace Pedlar to bring him on board as his secretary? It would be a unique glance of getting safely out of England and dodging the hue and cry. But how did he square Sir Eustace? He looks as though he had some hold over him. Or over Paget, I suggested in spite of myself. You don't seem to like Paget, Anne. Sir Eustace says he's a most capable and hard-working young man, and really he may be, for all we know, against him. Well, to continue my surmises, Raeburn is the man in the brown suit. He had read the paper he dropped. Therefore, misled by the dot as you were, he attempts to reach cabin 17 at 1 o'clock on the 22nd, having previously tried to get possession of the cabin through Paget. On the way there, somebody knives him. Who? I interloped. Chichester. Yes, it all fits in. Cable to Lord Nasby that you have found the man in the brown suit, and your fortune's made, Anne. There are several things that you've overlooked. What things? Raeburn's got a scar, I know, but a scar can be faked easily enough. He's the right height and build. What's the description of the head with which you pulverized them at Scotland Yard? I trembled. Suzanne was a well-educated, well-read woman. but I prayed that she might not be conservant with technical terms of anthropology. Dolichocephalic, I said lightly. Suzanne looked doubtful. Was that it? Yes, long-headed, you know. A head whose width is less than 75% of its length, I replied fluently. There was a pause. I was just beginning to breathe freely when Suzanne said suddenly, "What's the opposite?" "What do you mean, the opposite?" "Well, there must be an opposite. What do you call heads whose breadth is more than 75% of their length?" "Brachycephalic," I murmured unwillingly. "That's it. I thought that was what you said." "Did I?" "It was a slip of the tongue. I meant dolichocephalic," I said with all the assurance I could muster. Suzanne looked at me searchingly. Then she laughed. "You lie very well, gypsy girl, but it will save time and trouble now if you tell me all about it." "There is nothing to tell," I said unwillingly. "Isn't there?" said Suzanne gently. "I suppose I shall have to tell you," I said slowly. "I'm not ashamed of it. You can't be ashamed of something that just happens to you. That's what he did. He was detestable, rude and ungrateful, but that I think I understand. It's like a dog that's been chained up or badly treated. It'll bite anybody. That's what it was like, bitter and snarling. I don't know why I care, but I do. I care horribly. Just seeing him has turned my whole life upside down. I love him. I want him. I'll walk all over Africa barefoot till I find him, and I'll make him care for me. I'd die for him. I'd work for him, slave for him, steal for him, even beg or borrow for him. There, now you know." Suzanne looked at me for a long time. "You're very un-English, gypsy girl," she said at last. "There's not a scrap of a sentimental about you. I've never met anyone who was at once so practical and so passionate. I shall never care for anyone like that, mercifully for me, and yet I envy you, gypsy girl. It's something to be able to care. Most people can't. But what a mercy for your little doctor man that you didn't marry him. He doesn't sound at all the sort of individual who would enjoy keeping high explosives in the house. So there's to be no cabling to Lord Nasby. I shook my head. "And yet you believe him to be innocent?" "I also believe that innocent people can be hanged." "Yes, but Anne, dear, you can face facts. Face them now. In spite of all you say, he may have murdered this woman." "No," I said, "he didn't." "That's sentiment." "No, it isn't. He might have killed her. He may even have followed her there with that idea in mind. But he wouldn't take a bit of black cord and strangle her with it. If he'd done it, he would have strangled her with his bare hands." Suzanne gave a little shiver. Her eyes narrowed appreciatively. "And I am beginning to see why you find this young man of yours so attractive." I personally am a little lost. I did not know that she had these feelings for the man in the brown suit. I certainly didn't see it coming. I don't think she alluded to it. Chapter 16. I got an opportunity of tackling Colonel Race on the following morning. The auction of the sweep had just been concluded, and we walked up and down the deck together. "How's the gypsy this morning? Longing for land in her caravan?" I shook my head. "Now that the sea is behaving so nicely, I feel I should like to stay on it forever and ever." "What enthusiasm! Well, isn't it lovely this morning?" We leaned together over the rail. It was a glassy calm. The sea looked as though it had been oiled. There were great patches of color in it, blue, pale green, emerald, purple, and deep orange, like a cubist painting. There was an occasional flash of silver that showed the flying fish. The air was moist and warm, almost sticky. Its breath was like a perfumed caress. "There was a very interesting story you told us last night," I said, breaking the silence. "Which one?" "The one about the diamonds." "I believe women are always interested in diamonds." "Of course we are. By the way, what became of the other young man? You said there were 2 of them." "Young Lucas? Well, of course they couldn't prosecute one without the other, so he went scot-free too." "What happened to him? Eventually, I mean. Does anyone know?" Colonel Race was looking straight ahead of him, out to sea. His face was as devoid of expression as a mask, but I had an idea that he did not like my questions. Nevertheless, he replied readily enough. "He went to the war and acquitted himself bravely. He was reported missing and wounded, believed killed." That told me what I needed to know. I asked no more. But more than ever I wondered how much Colonel Race knew. The part he was playing in all this puzzled me. One other thing I did. That was to interview the night steward. With a little financial encouragement, I soon got him to talk. "The lady wasn't frightened, was she, miss? It seemed a harmless sort of joke. A bet, or so I understood." I got it all out of him little by little. On the voyage from Cape Town to England, one of the passengers had handed him a roll of film with instructions that they were to be dropped onto the bunk in cabin 71 at 1 a.m. on January 22nd on the outward journey. A lady would be occupying the cabin, and the affair was described as a bet. I gathered the steward had been liberally paid for his part in this transaction. The lady's name had not been mentioned. Of course, as Mrs. Blair went straight into cabin 71, interviewing the purser as soon as she got on board, it never occurred to the steward that she was not the lady in question. The name of the passenger who had arranged the transaction was Carton, and his description tallied exactly with that of the man killed on the tube. So one mystery, at all events, was cleared up, and the diamonds were obviously the key to the whole situation. Those last days on the Kilmorden seemed to pass very quickly. As we drew nearer and nearer to Cape Town, I was forced to consider carefully my future plans. There were so many people I wanted to keep an eye on. Mr. Chichester, Sir Eustace and his secretary, and, yes, Colonel Race. What was I to do about it? Naturally, it was Chichester who had first claim on my attention. Indeed, I was on the point of reluctantly dismissing Sir Eustace and Mr. Paget from their position of suspicious characters, when a chance conversation awakened fresh doubts in my mind. I had forgotten Mr. Paget's incomprehensible emotion at the mention of Florence. On the last evening on board, we were all sitting on deck, and Sir Eustace addressed a perfectly innocent question to his secretary. I forget exactly what it was, something to do with railway delays in Italy, but at once I noticed that Mr. Paget was displaying the same uneasiness which had caught my attention before. When Sir Eustace claimed Mrs. Blair for a dance, I quickly moved into the chair next to to the secretary. I was determined to get to the bottom of the matter. "I've always longed to go to Italy," I said, "and especially to Florence. Didn't you enjoy it very much there?" "Indeed I did, Miss Bedingfield. If you'll excuse me, there is some correspondence of Sir Eustace's that—" I took hold of him firmly by his coat sleeve. "Oh, you mustn't run away," I cried with the skittish accent of an elderly dowager. I'm sure Sir Eustace wouldn't like you to leave me alone with no one to talk to. You never seem to want to talk about Florence. Oh, Mr. Paget, I believe you have a guilty secret." I still had my hand on his arm, and I could feel the sudden start he gave. "Not at all, Miss Bedingfield, not at all," he said earnestly. "I should be only too delighted to tell you all about it, but there really are some cables—" "Oh, Mr. Paget, what a thin pretense!" "I shall tell Sir Eustace." I got no further. He gave another jump. The man's nerves seemed in a shocking state. What is it you want to know? The resigned martyrdom of his tone made me smile inwardly. Oh, everything. The pictures, the olive trees. I paused, rather at a loss myself. I suppose you speak Italian? I resumed. Not a word, unfortunately, but, of course, with hall porters and, guides. Exactly, I hastened to reply. And which was your favorite picture? Oh, the Madonna? Raphael, you know. Dear old Florence, I murmured sentimentally. So picturesque on the banks of the Arno. Beautiful river. And the Duomo. You remember the Duomo? Of course, of course. Another beautiful river, is it not? I hazarded. Almost more beautiful than the Arno. Decidedly so, I should say. Emboldened by the success of my little trap, I proceeded further, but there was little room for doubt. Mr. Paget delivered himself into my hands with every word he uttered. The man had never been in Florence in his life. But if not in Florence, where had he been? In England? Actually in England at the time of the Mill House mystery? I decided on a bold step. The curious thing is, I said, that I fancied I had seen you somewhere before. But I must be mistaken, since you were in Florence at the time, and yet... I studied him frankly. There was a haunted look in his eyes. He passed his tongue over his dry lips. Where did I think I saw you? I finished for him. At Marlow. You know Marlow? Why, of course, how stupid of me. Sir Eustace has a house there. But with an incoherent murmured excuse, my victim rose and fled. That night I invaded Suzanne's cabin, alight with excitement. You see, Suzanne, I had urged as I finished my tale, he was in England, in Marlow, at the time of the murder. Are you so sure now that the man in the brown suit is guilty? I'm sure of one thing, Suzanne said, twinkling unexpectedly. What's that? That the man in the brown suit is better looking than poor Mr. Paget. No, Anne, don't get cross. I was only teasing. Sit down there. Joking apart, I think you've made a very important discovery. Up till now, we've considered Paget as having an alibi. Now we know he hasn't. Exactly, I said. We must keep an eye on him. As well as everybody else, she said ruefully. Well, that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. That and finance. No, don't stick your nose in the air. I know you are absurdly proud and independent, but you've got to listen to horse sense over this. We're partners. I wouldn't offer you a penny because I liked you or because you're a friendless girl. What I want is a thrill, and I'm prepared to pay for it. We're going into this together regardless of expense. To begin with, you'll come with me to the Mount Nelson Hotel at my expense, and we'll plan out our campaign. We argued the point. In the end, I gave in, but I didn't like it. I wanted to do the thing on my own. That's settled, said Suzanne at last, getting up and stretching herself with a big yawn. Oh, I'm exhausted with my own eloquence. Now then, let us discuss our victims. Mr. Chichester is going on to Durban. Sir Eustace is going to the Mount Nelson Hotel in Cape Town, and then to Rhodesia. He's going to have a private car on the railway, and in a moment of expansion after his 4th glass of champagne the other night, he offered me a place in it. I dare say he didn't really mean it, but all the same, he can't very well back out of it if I hold him to it. Good, I approved. You keep an eye on Sir Eustace and Mr. Paget, and I take on Chichester. But what about Colonel Race? Suzanne looked at me queerly. And you can't possibly suspect... I don't. I suspect everybody. I'm in the mood where when one looks round for the most unlikely person. Colonel Race is going to Rhodesia, too, said Suzanne thoughtfully. If we could arrange for Sir Eustace to invite him also, you can manage it. You can manage anything. I love butter, purred Suzanne. I don't know what butter has to do with anything, but okay. We parted on the other understanding that Suzanne would employ her talents to her best advantage. I felt too excited to go to bed immediately. It was my last night on board. Early morning tomorrow, we should be in Table Bay. I slipped up on deck. The breeze was fresh and cool. The boat was rolling a little in the choppy sea. The decks were dark and deserted. It was after midnight. I leaned over the rail, watching the phosphorescent trail of foam. Ahead of us lay Africa. We were rushing towards it through the dark waters. I felt alone in a wonderful world. Wrapped in a strange peace, I stood there, taking no heed of time, lost in a dream. And suddenly I had a curious, intimate premonition of danger. I had heard nothing, but I swung round instinctively. A shadowy form had crept up behind me. As I turned, it sprang. One hand gripped my throat, stifling any cry I might have uttered. I fought desperately, but I had no chance. I was half choking from the grip on my throat, but I bit and clung and scratched in the most approved feminine fashion. The man was handicapped by having to keep me from crying out. If he had succeeded in reaching me unawares, it would have been easy enough for him to sling me overboard with a sudden heave. The sharks would have taken care of the rest. Struggle as I would, I felt myself weakening. My assailant felt it too. He put out all his strength, and then, running on swift, noiseless feet, another shadow joined us. With one blow of his fist, he sent my opponent crashing headlong to the deck. Released, I fell back against the rail, sick and trembling. My rescuer turned to me with a quick movement. "You're hurt!" There was something savage in his tone, a menace against the person who had dared to hurt me. Even before he spoke, I had recognized him. It was my man, the man with the scar. But that one moment in which his attention had been diverted to me had been enough for the fallen enemy. Quick as a flash, he had risen to his feet and taken to his heels down the deck. With an oath, Rayburn sprang after him. I always hate being out of things. I joined the chase, a bad third. Round the deck we went to the starboard side of the ship. There, by the saloon door, lay the man in a crumpled heap. Rayburn was bending over him. "Did you hit him again?" I called breathlessly. "There was no need," he replied grimly. "I found him collapsed by the door, or else he couldn't get it open in his shaming and his shamming. We'll soon see about that, and we'll see who he is, too." With a beating heart, I drew nearer. I had realized at once that my assailant was a bigger man than Chichester. Anyway, Chichester was a flabby creature who might use a knife at a pinch, but who would have little strength with his bare hands. Rayburn struck a match. We both uttered an ejaculation. The man was Guy Paget. Rayburn appeared absolutely stupefied by the discovery. "Paget," he murmured. "My God, Paget." I felt a slight sense of superiority. "You seem surprised." "I am," he said heavily. "I never suspected—" He wheeled suddenly round on me. "And you? You're not? You recognized him, I suppose, when he attacked you?" "No, I didn't. All the same, I'm not very surprised." He stared at me suspiciously. "Where do you come in, I wonder? How much do you know?" I smiled. "A good deal, Mr. Lucas." He caught my arm. The unconscious strength of his grip made me wince. "Where did you get that name?" he asked hoarsely. "Isn't it yours?" I demanded sweetly. "Or do you prefer to be called the man in the brown suit?" That did stagger him. He released my arm and fell back a pace or two. "Are you a girl or a witch?" he breathed. "I'm a friend." I advanced a step towards him. "I offered you my help once. I offer it again. Will you have it?" The fierceness of his answer took me back. "No! I'll have no truck with you or with any woman. Do your damnedest." As before, my own temper began to rise. "Perhaps," I said, "you don't realize how much in my power you are. Word from me to the captain. Say it, he sneered. Then advancing with a quick step, and whilst we're realizing things, my dear girl, do you realize you're in my power this minute? I could take you by the throat like this. With a swift gesture, he suited the action to the word. I felt his two hands clasp my throat and press, ever so little. Like this, and squeeze the life out of you, and then, like our unconscious friend here, but with more success, fling your dead body to the sharks. What do you say to that? I said nothing. I laughed, and yet I knew that the danger was real. Just at that moment he hated me. But I knew that I loved the danger, loved the feeling of his hands on my throat. That I would not have exchanged that moment for any moment in my life. With a short laugh he released me. What's your name? He asked abruptly. Anne Bedingfeld. Does nothing frighten you, Anne Bedingfeld? Oh, yes, I said, with an assumption of coolness I was far from feeling. Wasps, sarcastic women, very young men, cockroaches, and superior shop assistants. He gave the same short laugh as before. Then he stirred the unconscious form of Paget with his feet. What shall we do with this junk? Throw it overboard? He asked carelessly. If you like, I answered with equal calm. I admire your whole-hearted, bloodthirsty instincts, Miss Bedingfeld, but we will have him to recover at his leave him to recover at his leisure. He is not seriously hurt. You shrink from second murder, I see, I said sweetly. A second murder? He looked genuinely puzzled. The woman at Marlow, I reminded him, watching the efforts of my words closely. An ugly, brooding expression settled down on his face. He seemed to have forgotten my presence. I might have killed her, he said. Sometimes I believe that I meant to kill her. A wild rush of feeling, hatred of the dead woman, surged through me. I could have killed her that moment had she stood before me. For he must have loved her once. He must, to have felt like that. I regained control of myself and spoke in my normal voice. We seem to have said all there is to be said, except good night. Good night and goodbye, Miss Bedingfeld. Au revoir, Mr. Lucas. Again he flinched at the name. He came nearer. Why do you say that? Au revoir, I mean. Because I have a fancy that we shall meet again. Not if I can help it. Emphatic as his tone was, it did not offend me. On the contrary, I hugged myself with secret satisfaction. I'm not quite a fool. All the same, I said gravely, I think we shall. Why? I shook my head, unable to explain the feeling that had actuated my words. I never wish to see you again, he said suddenly and violently. It was really a very rude thing to say, but I only laughed softly and slipped away into the darkness. I heard him start after me, and then pause, and a word floated down the deck. I think it was witch. Looks like we have time for one more chapter, and it is an excerpt from the diary of Sir Eustace Pedlar. Chapter 17. Mount Nelson Hotel, Cape Town. It is really the greatest relief to be off the Kilmorden. The whole time that I was on board, I was conscious of being surrounded by a network of intrigue. To put the lid on everything, Guy Paget must needs engage in a drunken brawl last night. It is all very well to explain it away, but that is what it actually amounts to. What else would you think of a man if a man comes to you with a lump the size of an egg on the side of his head and an eye colored all the tints of the rainbow? Of course, Paget would insist on trying to be mysterious about the whole thing. According to him, you would think his black eye was the direct result of his devotion to my interest. His story was extraordinarily vague and rambling, and it was all a long time before I could make head or tail of it. To begin with, it appears he caught sight of a man behaving suspiciously. Those are Paget's words. He had taken them straight from the pages of the German spy story. What he means by a man behaving suspiciously he doesn't know himself. I said so to him. He was slinking along in a very furtive manner, and it was the middle of the night, Sir Eustace. Well, what are you doing yourself? Why weren't you in bed and asleep like a good Christian? I demanded irritably. I had been coding these cables of yours, Sir Eustace, and typing the diary up to date. Trust Paget to be always in the right and a martyr over it. Well? I just thought I would have a look round before turning in, Sir Eustace. The man was coming down the passage from your cabin. I thought at once there was something wrong by the way he looked about him. He slunk up the stairs by the saloon. I followed him. My dear Paget, I said, why shouldn't the poor chap go on deck without having his footsteps dogged? Lots of people even sleep on deck. Very uncomfortable, I've always thought. Sailors wash you down with the rest of the deck at 5 a.m. I shuddered at the idea. Anyway, I continued, if you went worrying some poor devil who was suffering from insomnia, I don't wonder he landed you one. Paget looked patient. If you would hear me out, Sir Eustace, I would convince the man had been prowling about near your cabin, where he had no business to be. The only 2 cabins down that passage are yours and Colonel Race's. Race, I said, lighting a cigar carefully, can look after himself without your assistance, Paget. I added as an afterthought, so can I. Paget came nearer and breathed heavily, as he always does before imparting a secret. You see, Sir Eustace, I fancied, and now indeed I am sure, it was Rayburn. Rayburn? Yes, Sir Eustace. I shook my head. Rayburn has far too much sense to attempt to wake me up in the middle of the night. Quite so, Sir Eustace. I think it was Colonel Race he went to see. Secret meeting. For orders. Don't hiss at me, Paget, I said, drawing back a little. And do control your breathing. Your idea is absurd. Why should they want to have a secret meeting in the middle of the night? If they'd anything to say to each other, they could hobnob over beef tea in a perfectly casual and natural manner. I could see that Paget was not in the least convinced. Something was going on last night, Sir Eustace, he urged. Or why should Rayburn assault me so brutally? You're quite sure it was Rayburn? Paget appeared to be perfectly convinced of that. It was the only part of the story that he wasn't vague about. There's something very queer about all this, he said. To begin with, where is Rayburn? It's perfectly true that we haven't seen the fellow since we came on shore. He did not come up to the hotel with us. I decline to believe that he is afraid of Paget, however. Altogether, the whole thing is very annoying. One of my secretaries has vanished into the blue, and the other one looks like a disreputable prize-fighter. I can't take him about with me in his present condition. I shall be the laughing-stock of Cape Town. I have an appointment later in the day to deliver old Milray's billet doux, but I shall not take Paget with me. Confound the fellow and his prowling ways. Although I'm decidedly out of temper, I had a poisonous breakfast with poisonous people, Dutch waitresses with thick ankles who took half an hour to bring me a bad bit of fish, and this farce of getting up at 5 a.m. on arrival at the port to see a blinking doctor and hold your hands above your head simply makes me tired. Later. A very serious thing has occurred. I went to my appointment with the Prime Minister, taking Milray's sealed letter. It didn't look as though it had been tampered with, but inside was the blank sheet of paper. Now, I suppose, I'm in the devil of a mess. Why I ever let that bleating old fool Milray embroil me in the matter I can't think. Paget is a famous Job's comforter. He displays a certain gloomy satisfaction that maddens me. Also, he had taken advantage of my perturbation to saddle me with a stationary trunk. Unless he is careful, the next funeral he attends will be his own. However, in the end I had to listen to him. Supposing, Sir Eustace, that Rayburn had overheard a word or two of your conversation with Mr. Milray in the street. Remember, you had no written authority from Mr. Milray. You accepted Rayburn on his own valuation. You think Rayburn is a crook, then? I said slowly. Paget did. How far his views were influenced by resentment over his black eye, I don't know. He made out a pretty fair case against Rayburn, and the appearance of the latter told against him. My idea was to do nothing in the matter. A man who has permitted himself to be made a thorough fool of is not anxious to broadcast the fact. But Paget, his energy unimpaired by his recent misfortunes, was all for vigorous measures. He had his way, of course. He bustled out to the police station, sent innumerable cables, and brought a herd of English and Dutch officials to drink whiskies and sodas at my expense. We got Milray's answer that evening. He knew nothing of my late secretary. There was only one spot of comfort to be exacted from the situation. At any rate, I said to Paget, you weren't poisoned. You had one of your ordinary bilious attacks. I saw him wince. It was my only score. Later. Paget is in his element. His brain positively scintillates with bright ideas. He will have it now that Rayburn is none other than the famous man in the brown suit. I dare say he's right. He usually is. But all this is getting unpleasant. The sooner I get off to Rhodesia, the better. I have explained to Paget that he is not to accompany me. You see, my dear fellow, I said, you must remain here on the spot. You might be required to identify Rayburn any minute. And besides, I have my dignity as an English member of Parliament to think of. I can't go about with a secretary who has apparently recently been indulging in a vulgar street brawl. Paget winced. He's such a respectable fellow that his appearance is pain and tribulation to him. But what will you do about your correspondence and the notes for your speech, Sir Eustace? I shall manage, I said airily. Your private car is to be attached to the 11 o'clock train tomorrow, Wednesday morning, Paget continued. I've made all arrangements. Is Mrs. Blair taking a maid with her? Mrs. Blair? I gasped. She tells me you offered her a place. So I did, now I come to think of it. On the night of the fancy dress ball, I even urged her to come. But I never thought she would. Delightful as she is, I do not know that I want Mrs. Blair's society all the way to Rhodesia and back. Women require such a lot of attention, and they are confoundedly in the way sometimes. Have I asked anyone else? I said nervously. One does these things in moments of expansion. Mrs. Blair seems to think that you had asked Colonel Race as well. I groaned. I must have been very drunk if I asked Race. Very drunk indeed. Take my advice, Paget, and let your black eye be a warning to you. Don't go on the bust again. As you know, I'm a teetotaler, Sir Eustace. Much wiser to take the pledge if you have a weakness that way. I haven't asked anyone else, have I, Paget? Not that I know of, Sir Eustace. I heaved a sigh of relief. There's Miss Bedingfeld, I said thoughtfully. She wants to go to Rhodesia to dig up bones, I believe. I've a good mind to offer her a temporary job as a secretary. She can typewrite, I know, for she's told me so. To my surprise, Paget opposed the idea vehemently. He does not like Anne Bedingfeld. Ever since the night of the black eye, he has displayed uncontrollable emotion whenever she is mentioned. Paget is full of mysteries nowadays. Just to annoy him, I shall ask the girl. As I said before, she has extremely nice legs. Well, on that so very lovely phrase, we have reached the end of our story time today. But next Storytime stream, we are going to be possibly concluding 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. That's going to be on Tuesday. And then Wednesday, also 2 to 4, we're going to be continuing The Man in the Brown Suit. And I'll be sure to write the correct name on the stream. Thank you. I know. I know. I'm sorry, Corel. Yeah, I try to keep it to 2 hours just so that, my voice doesn't get too scraggly. Because, I did the 4-hour-long stream of the Time Machine, and boy, was my throat not happy with me. But I still had fun, But there's always more. There's 3 story times a week, and I always have the videos you can go and watch. Thanks so much for hanging out with me, though. It's great to see you, Corel. Great to see you, Chittichol. I think that's how it's pronounced. And yeah, I'll let you know if I do any game or art streams. I know I have a Deponia stream coming up soon, so I'll let you know. You have a good day too, Corel. All right, bye.